Theranos ceased operations on August 31st, 2018, and the company was dissolved. In recent days, reports suggest there may be more criminal charges coming as part of a larger investigation into the company as a whole. After leaving Theranos, Tyler worked at Stanford's Center for Magnetic Nanotechnology. Currently, he is the CEO and co-founder of Flux Biosciences Incorporated, a startup that aims to bring medical-grade diagnostics into the home of consumers. Why don't you just start by telling us why you quit your job at Theranos?
The first big red flag was the first time I saw the Theranos device, and you could quickly see that it was not what it had been claimed to be. Like everything inside the device was something that I had already seen before in almost any other laboratory that I had been in up to that time. And you could quickly tell that it couldn't run, hundreds of tests. It couldn't even run 2 tests at the same time. And while I was there, we only got up to running 7 tests total. And if you wanted to run all of those 7 tests at the same time, those would have had to been on 7 different devices. So her claims of running, 300 or whatever tests from a single drop of blood seemed grossly exaggerated. Working with the devices, and I would see that the variations of the results that it produces was very high. And then in our daily lab meetings, we would kind of go over the experiments that we had done in the previous 24 hours and kind of pick and choose about what experiments needed to be repeated. So we would essentially just delete sections of an experiment and repeat it and replace it with new data. And at first that seems kind of weird, but then you eventually kind of like fall into the habit of doing that, and it's a really bad habit. And then I started hearing about the quality controls failing, and this is with my colleagues who are running real patient samples. So they would run the quality controls for the day, and they would fail, and then some select cases they would be pressured to run patient samples anyway, even though we knew that the test wasn't functioning properly. And then quality controls would fail multiple days in a row, which is a really bad sign because statistically you should know how often a quality control should fail. And we were failing way more often than that, and we were coming up with ways on how to prevent reporting quality control failures. And then there was an incident where the CLIA inspectors came to inspect the laboratory, but they essentially locked the door to the room that had all the Theranos devices in, so they only saw like the third-party Siemens, FDA-cleared type equipment. And when we got that sample, we split it and we ran it on the Theranos devices and the Siemens equipment. And the results were off by sometimes more than 300%. And we decided to report the results from the Siemens equipment, not from the Theranos devices, even though we were running patient samples on the Theranos devices. Assay validation was really affecting quality controls and ultimately patient samples. And I felt like, our practices of what I'm doing here are so bad that it's affecting patients' results. So then I went and I had some questions, and I went to Elizabeth and I kind of brought a couple of these things up, and she said, oh, that doesn't sound right, and I'll set you up with a meeting with the statistics vice president so we can explain to you how statistics is done. And I said that I've heard her say, and I've seen on our website, that our coefficient of variation is less than 10%, but I almost never saw that to actually be the case. And she said, no, I don't think we say that. Let's check the website. So we went around to her computer and looked at the website, and on the home page, first page, in big bold, it says CV less than 10%. And then in smaller writing underneath, it says vitamin D. And she says, we've only made that claim for vitamin D. It's not meant to be indicative of our assay performance as a whole. So who knows if this actually works in the real world. I said, we claim that we're fast, cheaper, more accurate, and I don't think any of those things are true. And he says, I don't think we've ever claimed that we're more accurate. I said, really? That's weird. And he said, if you see any materials that say we're more accurate, let me know. So I went back to my desk, and you Google Theranos, and every article says faster, cheaper, more accurate, faster, cheaper, more accurate, faster, cheaper, more accurate. So I go back to him with all these articles, and I say, what's going on here? If this is incorrect, we should actually go correct this information, since we're saying that we are bringing transparency to blood testing. So if this isn't correct, we should proactively correct it. And he said, yeah, I think Elizabeth just tends to exaggerate in interview type settings. Actually, instead asked that I write all of my concerns in an email. And I'm actually really thankful that I did that, because now it's all documented. So I wrote a really long email with all of these concerns in it and sent it to Elizabeth. And essentially, Sunny replied, who was the president/boyfriend, saying, in an even longer email, and essentially just saying that I was arrogant, ignorant, patronizing, reckless, no understanding of math, science, or basic statistics, and that if I had any other last name, that I would have already been held accountable to the strongest extent. So
he doubled
that's
down.
why I decided to quit.
Yeah.
I was naively hoping that I would be listened to. So I really wanted to bring these concerns to Elizabeth and actually work through them. You know, she was on the cover of Forbes and Inc., and to me, those interviews went like this: Elizabeth, how great are you? And she would say, I am really great. And they would report, Elizabeth is really great. And that was pretty much the extent of the interview. No one had asked her a hard question, or if they did, she didn't answer it. And it looked like John really wanted to ask hard questions. And so I did some research on John, and I saw that based on his past reporting, that people had been arrested. So like action had happened after John's reporting, which made me have a lot of confidence that it would be worth it. And I actually told my parents about John, and they said, that's awesome, but don't talk to him.
Identify yourself as a whistleblower, because if I remember correctly, this is another thing that your parents said would be a bad idea.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. But you did it anyway.
Yeah, so that happened more than a year after the first time I contacted John, I think. And, you know, at that time, when I outed myself as a whistleblower, I think the writing was already on the wall. So, the Wall Street Journal had published a bunch of articles about Theranos already. The CLIA came out with their report that said there was documented times where quality controls failed and then patient samples were run anyway, which is one of the things I had alleged. It had come out that they had shell corporations buying third-party laboratory equipment so they could essentially hide that they had these other laboratories. David Boyce, who was their general counsel, said that when the inspectors came to look at the labs, that they didn't ask to see the Theranos devices, which is why they weren't shown that lab. So basically all the things that I had said, felt like I had been proven to be correct. But Elizabeth was still having, you know, weekly luncheons with my grandfather. He was still on their board of directors. David Boyce, who was really bullying me, was still their general counsel and on their board of directors. And Elizabeth was still going to our family functions, and I was still being followed by private investigators. And I just felt like I have so much power right now, because when Theranos first thought that I'd spoken to the Wall Street Journal, they had my grandfather call me, and I ended up going to his house just to talk to my grandfather. And I explicitly said I want to talk to my grandfather without lawyers, because it was clear at that point that Theranos wanted me to talk to their lawyers. And I said, I want to come talk to you, not to lawyers. So I went to his house, and I rehashed all of these old conversations that I had had with him, where I said this thing doesn't exist, essentially, and we're giving patients bad results. We're not testing on the Theranos devices. But he didn't believe me. And then he just said that there was a one-page confidentiality agreement, and if I agreed to sign it, that a world of trouble would go away. And I said, okay, I'll sign a one-page confidentiality agreement. And then he said, actually, there are 2 lawyers here right now. Can I go get them? And I said, okay. And so these lawyers come in, and they don't give me a one-page confidentiality agreement. They give me a temporary restraining order letter signed by David Boyce. I don't remember exactly what was in the letter, but it was basically like, you're a terrible person, signed David Boyce. So this was nothing like a one-page confidentiality agreement.
Or just to talk with your grandfather.
Yeah, or just to talk with my grandfather. This was nothing like what I expected. And that story hadn't come out yet, and I thought that would make them look really bad. And I felt like I had proven to be right, and I had this story, and they were still following me with private investigators. Elizabeth was still going to my family functions. I just felt like they had no respect for me, and I just felt like I wanted to show that I was willing to stand up for myself, and that's why I outed myself. Ultimately, bullied, intimidated, end up racking up legal fees. But I think I'm different in that it seems like most whistleblowers have a tough time getting their life back on track afterwards, and they have a tough time getting a job in the same industry. But that has not been the case for me. Like right after I outed myself in the Wall Street Journal, I was getting job offers from different biotech companies. I was getting job offers from venture capital companies. People just emailing me say, "We'd love to have you work with us," which is the exact opposite of what I was expecting. Everyone was telling me that once you're kind of pegged as a whistleblower, that you're not going to be able to get a job in that field. And I don't know exactly why my experience is different than the normal experience.
It could have to do with your relative youth. I mean, the fact that somebody that early in their career is that comfortable with their own thought process and can overrule every outside piece of advice they're getting and still sort of stay the course, that could be pretty compelling for future employers.
For those months were somewhere around like $400,000. Actually, I guess that $400,000 was more than just those 4 months, but the meat of it was those 4 or 5 months. And during that time, I wasn't really thinking about, I was only thinking about money as a resource. Like, I didn't have an emotional attachment to money. I really saw it as like runway, like how long can I fight Theranos with this X amount of money. My legal fees for those months were somewhere around like $400,000. Sometimes I feel like people paint a picture of me that's actually better than it is. Like when I look back at that moment, I don't even know if that was necessarily like a good thing for me to say like, yeah, I'm willing to, put my parents out of a house to keep fighting this fight.
There were a lot of conflicting roles here.
Yeah.
I mean, the family obligations, you had colleagues that you worked with that you considered friends, supervisors, so lots of different roles to kind of sort through in terms of whose interests to put first, and how to go about doing that. So I think given the situation, you've done a very nice job of doing that. There was a number of people just in that list that were misled in this story. Talk about inspectors, investors, different people in the company. Why do you think that was possible?
Because trade secrets.
Trade secrets. Say a little more about that.
That's what Elizabeth's answer to any tough question would be. I can't tell you because trade secrets. The SEC, came out with their findings. I was actually over at his house just to see my aunts and uncles who were in town. And he kind of stopped the conversation and said, well, the SEC came out with this report, and I had no idea the extent to which Theranos had been lying, and I'm really proud of Tyler for standing up for what he believes in. Really idolized my grandfather, and my grandfather actually has a track record of having a really strong moral compass. And he would always say, like, you can't love your job too much, otherwise you'll do things you wouldn't ordinarily do in order to keep your job. So you should always be willing to quit a job. And my parents, are the best people. I think I got lucky there. Like my dad, like one of my earliest memories ever actually is when I was in kindergarten. There was like a classmate of mine who had just come from Japan, didn't speak any English. It's like my parents worked with me to learn how to say like, can I be your friend in Japanese so that I could like befriend this kid. And that's like one of my earliest memories ever. So those were the parents that I had grown up with. I don't really remember there being like community values or like necessarily a mission statement that was formalized, but it was obvious that their value was work really hard. And not necessarily work smart, just work a long time. She would say, our goal is to never have to say goodbye too soon. And she would tell this story of her uncle who passed away, too young from, I don't remember, some kind of cancer. So there was that, and she was really inspiring she was a really inspiring leader. Like she made every person feel like they were super important to achieving the vision of the company. I mean, the workplace felt like you were on a sinking ship the whole time, for sure. At least, so for me, I felt like there were two different worlds. There was the carpeted world and there was the tile world. So the carpeted world was where the product managers were, was where the executives were, was where software engineers were. And then there was the tiled world where all of the labs were. So all the research, all the Theranos devices, all the CLIA labs, all that was in the tiled world. And they were just completely two separate realities. And it was really hard for me to reconcile the differences. Like I would go talk to Elizabeth, and we would talk about the vision of the company, and I would feel so motivated, and she would tell me about how what I was doing was so important to achieving that vision. And I would go back feeling so motivated, and I would start doing the lab work, and then I would go, wait, what? This is what we were talking about? How did that happen? She's very convincing, and I can see how if you weren't working with the devices every day, how it would be hard to believe that she's lying to you. The board didn't really have any power. Like it was kind of like a fake board. So you have to make sure that the board actually has powers. And then the other thing I think would be extremely important, I don't know if there's a practical way to do this, but just talk to the person who's pipetting. Whoever's doing this kind of work, talk to that person and ask them what they're doing and how things are looking. Board director came and asked me like, what is this experiment telling you that you're working on right now? I would say this experiment is telling me that this device does not work.
Maybe it's better to think about now you sort of have your own enterprise and some responsibility for some other colleagues. As somebody in that role, what do you think the important things are that you take away from the experience you've had?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to trust the people that you hire. And so Elizabeth hired all these great scientists, but then didn't listen to anything they had to say. Felt like I had some form of immunity because I had a personal relationship with Elizabeth. Felt like I was in a position that no one else was, where maybe I would be listened to. So that's kind of why I decided to speak up.
Hi, my name is Seth Michelson, and I was the CSO at Theranos in 2010. I walked out because of the same things you saw. First of all, great job, bro.
Wow.
My name is Father Paul Goda. I taught in the law school here for 40 years, and my question hinges on your connection with the legal system. $400,000 in a relatively short time. I don't understand that, and I'm curious about your reaction to the complexity of the legal system and the cost, because my question is, what in the hell is going on?
I don't know. I mean, I was really disappointed in the legal system. Like, when I was going through this, it really felt like we settled disputes over a game of one-on-one basketball, and you can pay whoever you want to go play for you. So, like, Theranos could, pay LeBron James to go play one-on-one for them, and then whoever they're suing has to pick, in most cases, like, a high school basketball player to go play against LeBron James, and that's kind of how things are settled. Luckily, I was in a position where I could actually get someone who was really good to go play for me and put up a fight. But yeah, overall I was pretty disappointed, and I just can't imagine, there's like a huge privilege aspect to this story, and the only reason I could do what I did was because I was willing to spend $1 million doing it. On the flip side of that, I had a colleague, Erica, who had the same concerns that I did, also spoke to John Carreyrou, also reached out to state regulators, which I did not know about. And she comes from a very different background than I did. She was in student debt still when she quit Theranos, so she didn't have that. And she, we took the same steps, but then when the Theranos lawyers approached her, she ended up, moving to Hong Kong and putting her head down and ignoring them, which turned out to be a really good idea. I should have done that. You have to make sure that you distinguish what is vision and what is where you are now. Mm-hmm. And Elizabeth, those somehow became one thing. It's like right now we can run 300 things from a drop of blood, and that wasn't really true, but that was the vision. I went through that when I was fundraising. You come up with some revenue projections, you put it on a slide, and then the investor goes, no, we're looking for something bigger. And then later they'll kind of tell you, by the way, investors assume that you're doubling your revenue, that you take what you actually think and you double it. So in the investor's mind, they're halving it. So it's this stupid game that everyone's playing, and I just didn't want to play it, so I just took the revenue slide out.
My name is Mara. I'm an alum, and my local Safeway built one of those nice rooms for blood testing, and not until I read the book did I know why they had this great room. As somebody who needs to test their blood on a regular basis I'm on blood thinners. A wrong diagnosis, I could either bleed out or I could get a blood clot and have a stroke. So I wanted to personally thank you for what you did, because you could have very well saved my life.
Thank you.